Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Imagine being told you can't vote. Like you go to cast your ballot and they say, nope, not you, and the reason, the color of your skin. It's hard to even fathom that being a reality here in America, but just a few decades ago, that was the norm in Selma, Alabama.
It's a story that's as relevant today as it was then. Selma in the 60s, it was about as far from a true democracy as you could get, especially if you were black.
Absolutely. And we're not talking about subtle voter suppression here. This was blatant, right in your face.
It was a system designed to silence black voices from the get-go. Let's say, for example, you're a black citizen in Selma, and you finally reach voting age after generations of your family being denied that right. You're excited, you go to register, and bam, you're hit with something called a literacy test.
And these weren't your typical pop quizzes, were they?
Oh, not at all. We're talking about tests designed to be impossible, even for, say, a college professor to pass.
Give us an example. What kind of questions are we talking about here?
I've seen somewhere they'd ask you to recite some obscure clause from the state constitution. Or maybe they'd ask you to, I don't know, guess how many jelly beans are in a jar. Completely subjective and open to interpretation.
So even if you, by some miracle, answered everything correctly,
it didn't matter. The registrar, who was, you guessed it, almost always white, could just fail you on a whim.
A completely rigged system.
That's the reality in Selma back then. And it wasn't just these so-called literacy tests. Local officials, they had an entire, I guess you could say, arsenal of tactics at their disposal. Yeah. Kicking people off the voter rolls for ridiculous reasons, intimidation, sometimes even violence.
In the face of this oppression, a man who embodied that resistance to equality, that was Sheriff Jim Clark.
That name alone still sends shivers down my spine. Imagine the most hardcore segregationist you can, someone who just oozed racism. That was him. This was a man who would, I don't know how else to put it, he enjoyed inflicting fear, especially when it came to black citizens trying to exercise their rights.
I get chills just thinking about it. That kind of presence alone must have been terrifying, especially for those who are just trying to register to vote.
Oh, you're telling me. Imagine you're trying to fill out your registration form, and looming over you is Sheriff Clark and his posse, all armed to the teeth. Talk about intimidating.
It's a miracle anyone had the courage to even show up. And just to underscore how effective these tactics were, we have it's a horrifying statistic, isn't it?
It really is. Out of an estimated 15,000 black citizens eligible to vote in Selma at that time, how many do you think were actually registered?
Knowing what we know now, I'm almost afraid to guess.
A mere 383.
That's less than 3%. It's just, I don't even have words. It's a gut punch. Yeah. Realizing the magnitude of the disenfranchisement, the sheer silencing of an entire community.
And it's against this backdrop of fear and oppression that this movement began to rise, a movement that would eventually capture the nation's attention. The story of the Selma to Montgomery marches, a 54-mile testament to courage and to the unwavering belief in true democracy.
54 miles, it's hard to fathom walking that distance today, let alone under the constant threat of violence.
Oh, absolutely. And on March 7, 1965, these brave souls set out on that journey. That day, as you know, would go down in history as Bloody Sunday.
Things take a very dark turn, so set the scene for us. Who were these marchers, and what were they hoping to achieve?
Well, you had civil rights icons like John Lewis, who at the time was a young activist. He'd later go on to become a congressman. But the majority of them, they weren't famous. They were just ordinary people. Teachers, preachers, students, everyday people from all walks of life who shared one fundamental goal: the right to vote. Their plan was to march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, to I guess you could say peacefully protest this denial of their rights and to deliver their grievances to Governor George Wallace.
And Governor Wallace, just for context, he wasn't exactly known for his, let's say, open-mindedness when it came to civil rights, was he?
Let's just say he wasn't winning any awards from the NAACP. He was a staunch segregationist, dead set against any kind of equality for black citizens.
So you have this incredibly determined group of citizens marching for their rights, their voices literally echoing the spirit of justice and equality. But we know it wouldn't stay peaceful for long.
Sadly, you're right. The marchers, they didn't even make it out of Selma. See, they were trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, this completely normal-looking bridge that would later become, a symbol of the entire fight for voting rights. And that's when everything went wrong.
Because waiting for them on the other side
was a horrifying display of, it was state-sanctioned violence at its worst. Picture this. Hundreds of people, all committed to nonviolence, their only weapons, hope, and this belief in their right to vote. As they started to cross that bridge, they were met by this wall of state troopers, all armed to the teeth. And of course, Sheriff Clark and his posse, they were right there in the thick of it.
It was a recipe for disaster.
It was like something out of a nightmare. I mean, they unleashed tear gas, this cloud of stinging gas, choking these peaceful protesters, state troopers on horseback, just plowing into the crowd, beating people mercilessly.
Men, women, even children weren't spared. And the worst part is, it was all caught on camera.
And thank goodness for that. I mean, as horrifying as those images were, those grainy images broadcast into homes across America, they ripped away the facade, exposed the ugly truth of segregation for what it really was.
It was a turning point. Suddenly, everyone was forced to confront this brutality, this violence inflicted on citizens simply trying to exercise their right to vote.
And the pressure on President Johnson to do something, anything, it was immense.
And to his credit, he did act. 8 days after Bloody Sunday, Johnson gave that incredibly powerful speech before Congress.
Oh, it was electric. You could feel the tension, the weight of the nation's eyes on him. And Johnson, you could hear the emotion in his voice as he spoke. He talked about voting as like the very soul of America, the heart of our democracy.
And then came the line, a line borrowed from the civil rights movement itself, but in that moment it felt like a promise.
We shall overcome.
Powerful. Those words, uttered by the President of the United States, they signified a shift, a change in the air.
Absolutely. And Johnson, he wasn't just all talk. He used the momentum from Selma, from that horrific day, to push for legislation that had been stalled in Congress, the Voting Rights Act.
But even with all eyes on Selma, with the nation reeling from what happened there, the fight was far from over.
Oh, not even close. While politicians were debating in their ivory towers, the people of Selma, they weren't about to sit around and wait for justice to magically happen.
So they marched again.
They did. Yeah. Just 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday, thousands of people, now under the protection of federal troops sent in by President Johnson, set out again from Selma.
This time, they weren't alone.
No. People came from all over the country, people of all races and backgrounds, all united in their demand for equal rights. It was an incredible display of solidarity, and Dr. King, brilliant strategist that he was, he understood the power of that image, the world watching these thousands marching arm in arm, black, white, young, old. It was a message that transcended language.
It's hard to imagine that even after that second march, after all the attention on Selma, there was still resistance to the Voting Rights Act.
Oh, there was. Powerful forces, people determined to cling to the old ways, to keep Black Americans silenced and powerless. The fight in Congress, it was brutal, but something had shifted, something fundamental. Selma had awakened the conscience of America, and the world was watching.
And finally, on August 6, 1965, less than 5 months after Bloody Sunday, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. It was a victory hard won, a testament to the bravery of those marchers, to their unwavering belief in a better future.
It was a landmark moment, a victory not just for Black Americans, but for the very idea of democracy itself.
It's almost impossible to overstate just how silenced Black Americans were before the Voting Rights Act. We're talking about being completely shut out of the most fundamental act of citizenship, having a say in how their communities were run.
It really undermines the very idea of democracy, doesn't it, and the Voting Rights Act.
Well, it brought about some really significant changes, and I'm not just talking about on paper. This was about a transfer of power, about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long.
So, paint a picture for us what happened after the Voting Rights Act was passed. What those changes look like on the ground? Oh, the impact was almost immediate. We're talking about Black voter registration skyrocketing across the South. For example, in Mississippi, Black voter registration went from something like 7% in 1964 to over 60% just a few years later.
Wow.
It's astounding, right? And with that newfound political power came a wave of Black representation in government at all levels, something practically unheard of before 1965.
I mean, we're talking about places that had gone centuries without a single elected Black official, and then suddenly this seismic shift.
It really was a revolution at the ballot box, and the ripple effects, they were felt everywhere. Suddenly you had Black mayors, Black sheriffs, Black judges, even Black congresspeople, people who could finally give a voice to those who had been ignored for far too long.
It's a powerful reminder that voting rights, they aren't just some abstract concept. They have a very real impact on people's lives.
Couldn't agree more. Now, the Voting Rights Act, it didn't magically solve all of America's problems. Let's be real, the fight for equality is far from over. But it was a monumental victory, and it wouldn't have happened without the incredible bravery and sacrifice of those who marched in Selma. They were willing to put everything on the line for what they believed in, and their legacy continues to inspire us today.
It's humbling, isn't it? Their courage, it reminds us that progress is never guaranteed. It's something we have to constantly fight for, to be vigilant about protecting.
You got it. And we have to remember that the fight for voting rights is all connected to this larger fight for social and economic justice. When we talk about voter suppression, we're really talking about silencing certain voices, about keeping those in power, well, in power.
It's bigger than just casting a ballot. It's about ensuring everyone has an equal opportunity to shape the future, to have their voices heard.
Exactly. The legacy of Selma, it's a reminder that democracy is precious, it's fragile, and it requires constant effort to maintain. It's a fight that each generation has to take up to protect and to strengthen those rights.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Selma, into this pivotal moment in the fight for civil rights, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this story? What can we learn from the courage of those who marched from Selma to Montgomery?
I think the biggest takeaway is the power of collective action. The understanding that even when faced with overwhelming opposition, change is possible when people come together and demand it. It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our democracy and ensuring that the promise of equality, something so many fought and died for, well, that it's fully realized.
It's a legacy worth remembering, a legacy worth fighting for.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.